The rope bit deep into Katerina Wainwright's wrists as her husband dragged her through Copper Gulch's muddy streets like livestock bound for auction. Each stumbling step sent fire through her swollen belly, where her 7-month child kicked frantically against the violence. The mining camp reeked of wet timber coal smoke and the decay that had festered since the Great Flood 2 days past. Terror and rage warred in her chest. After crossing an ocean, burying her parents' surviving marriage to a man whose promises had crumbled into whiskey and cards, was this how it ended? Sold like property to pay gambling debts. "Please, Barnaby." She gasped, her Czech accent thick with desperation. "The baby, you're hurting the baby." "Shut your mouth." Barnaby Wainwright snarled, his bloodshot eyes wild. At 35, the gambling addict had the hollow look of a man who'd wagered away his soul. His once fine coat hung in tatters stained with whiskey and shame. "This mess is your doing as much as mine." A cruel laugh cut through his words. Silas Voss emerged from the crowd like a vulture sensing carrion, his black boots pristine despite the mire. The mine foreman stood tall at 40, possessing the cold confidence of a predator who'd never known defeat. His dark suit was immaculate, a gold watch chain glinting like a badge of authority. "Now, Barnaby." Silas' purred voice smooth as silk over steel. "Don't blame the lady for your weakness at cards. A debt's a debt and collateral is collateral." Katerina's heart hammered as she surveyed the faces miners with dead eyes, merchants calculating profit, women clutching shawls in shame. Since the flood had destroyed half the settlement, desperate people lived in tents while fever spread through the camps. The air crackled with barely contained violence. "This ain't legal." Deputy Amos Crowley protested weakly, his badge catching weak sunlight. But his voice carried no authority, eyes darting to Silas with poorly concealed fear. "Legal." Silas chuckled, producing folded papers. "Everything's documented proper. Barnaby signed his wife over as security. Fair and square." The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood. Someone whistled appreciatively. A pregnant woman would fetch fine price from the right buyer. Katerina closed her eyes, searching for the strength that had carried her across an ocean, through her parents' deaths, through marriage to a man whose promises had turned to betrayal. That was when she heard the voice, deep-accented, cutting through chaos like a blade. "How much?" Silence fell like a hammer blow. Heads turned toward the speaker, and Katerina's breath caught. A Lakota warrior stood at the crowd's edge, tall, broad-shouldered, his black hair braided with eagle feathers and trade beads. His face was carved bronze, all sharp angles and weathered strength, but his dark eyes held depths that spoke of great loss and unbreakable will. The silence stretched taut. A native man in a white mining camp, it was madness. Suicide. Tension crackled like lightning before a storm. "What did you say? Red skin?" Silas's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The warrior stepped forward with fluid grace. He wore buckskin leggings and a blue cavalry shirt that had seen better days, with a knife at his belt and rifle across his back. But those ancient eyes in a young face held everyone transfixed, eyes that had witnessed too much death. "I asked how much," he repeated, English careful but clear. "For her freedom." Someone spat. "You got brass, savage?" The warrior's gaze never wavered from Silas. "How much?" Silas studied him like a snake evaluating prey. "You got money, savage, real money." Without a word, the warrior reached into his shirt and withdrew a leather pouch. The soft clink of metal carried clearly in the stillness. He moved to an overturned barrel and poured the contents onto its surface. Spanish silver coins caught light like fallen stars. The crowd surged forward, eyes wide with greed. More money than most had seen in months. "That they're stolen," someone called. "Prove it." the warrior said quietly. Silas's eyes glittered as he counted. $50. That's what Barnaby owes. 53, Barnaby corrected desperately. With interest. The warrior selected coins with steady hands, movements deliberate and sure. $53 in Spanish silver. He looked up at Silas, then at Katerina, and she glimpsed something that made her heart skip, not pity, but recognition. The look of one survivor seeing another. For her freedom, he said, stepping back. The crowd erupted. Men surged for the silver, but the warrior's hand moved to his knife with deadly speed. They pulled back, muttering but unwilling to test his resolve. Barnaby lunged for the money, hands shaking as he scooped coins into his pockets. There, Silas' debt paid. But Silas wasn't watching the money. His gaze fixed on the warrior with intensity. You think you can walk into my town and buy what's mine? She is not yours, the warrior said simply. She's his wife. That makes her property. Not anymore. The warrior's voice carried winter ice finality. The debt is paid. As Barnaby fumbled with the rope, Katerina's eyes remained locked on the stranger who'd just purchased her freedom with his life savings. Why, what could drive a Lakota warrior to risk everything for a pregnant Czech woman? As if sensing her question, he looked directly at her. His eyes held pain depths that mirrored her own, the weight of loss, of choices that couldn't be undone. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't saving her. They were saving each other. What's your name, savage? Silas demanded. The warrior straightened to his full height. Maddo. It means bear. A drunk miner grabbed for remaining coins, but Maddo's knife appeared instantly, blade reflecting silver light. The man stumbled backward. Silas smiled without warmth. Well then, bear, you just made yourself a very dangerous enemy. Maddo sheathed his knife with deliberate slowness. I have many enemies. One more changes nothing. The rope fell from Katerina's wrists, leaving angry red marks. She rubbed circulation back into her hand's wedding ring, loose from weight loss. Around them, the crowd began dispersing, but she felt undercurrents of violence, hands resting on weapons, whispered promises of retribution. Barnaby pocketed the last silver and looked at his wife with something resembling regret. I'm sorry, Kate. I never meant go, she said quietly, voice steady despite trembling hands. Just go. He hesitated, then melted into the crowd like the coward he'd always been. She would never see him again, and the knowledge brought relief, not grief. Maddo approached, slowly, movements, careful and non-threatening. When close enough to speak without the crowd hearing, he said, Can you walk? She nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. Yes. We should not stay here. As they prepared to leave, Katerina felt a flutter in her belly that had nothing to do with fear. For the first time in months, she wasn't property. She wasn't collateral. She was free. The price had been 53 pieces of Spanish silver, and the courage of a man who owed her nothing. Behind them, Silas Voss watched their retreat with the patient smile of a hunter who'd just set his trap. Copper Gulch clung to the mountainside like a desperate parasite, its ramshackle buildings bearing testament to mankind's endless hunger for precious metal. The recent flood had carved fresh scars through the settlement, leaving broken timber-rusted equipment and shattered dreams. Half the structures stood empty, owners either drowned or departed, while survivors huddled in canvas tents, offering scant protection from mountain winds. Maddo knew he shouldn't have come. Every instinct screamed at him to fade into wilderness like smoke on wind. But the trail had led here, the blood trail of his sister's killers, and he wouldn't abandon it, no matter the cost. 6 months ago, white raiders had struck his band's winter camp along the Powder River. They'd come in deep cold before dawn, when wind carried away horse sounds and muffled dying screams. Maddo had been hunting elk in snow-heavy pines when he saw smoke rising from what had been home. He'd found Winona's body among burned lodges, his 19-year-old sister who'd laughed like summer rain and could track wounded deer through stone. The raiders had taken her scalp but left something more valuable, a blue-backed playing card trampled into frozen mud beside her body. On it, someone had scrawled a star outline. But there had been something else, something he'd only understood weeks later when examining her few scattered possessions. A small silver medallion, ornate and clearly not of native origin, clutched in her frozen fist. The piece bore markings he'd never seen, intricate engravings that spoke of wealth and craftsmanship far beyond anything found in their winter camp. The card had led him here, following whispered rumors through trading posts and cavalry camps, tracking men who wore star-notched spurs and whistled a particular tune, a broken melody Winona had once tried teaching him on a reed flute their grandfather carved. Now he sat in ruins of what had been the town's church, watching the settlement through gaps in burned timber. His paint-gelding Wikapo stood ground-tied nearby, ears pricked for danger. The animal had saved his life. More than once he trusted its instincts as much as his own. The Spanish silver had been meant for horses, good horses, to carry his scattered family north to safety. Instead, he'd spent his life savings on a pregnant white woman whose husband tried selling her like livestock. It should have been a mistake. It felt like destiny. He thought of her eyes, blue as deep water, but with steel underneath. Afraid, but not broken. Something in her bearing reminded him of Winona, that refusal to surrender, even when surrounded by wolves. "You're making a mistake," Deputy Amos Crowley said, emerging from shadows. "Many people have told me this today." "I'm serious." The deputy stepped closer, hand away from his weapon. At 35, Crowley had the soft look of a desk man, but his eyes held weight of someone who'd seen too much compromise. Silas Voss owns this town, the Mine Saloon, half the businesses. He's got men who'll kill for drink money, and right now he's madder than a wet hen. Maddo studied the man's face in dying light. "Why do you warn me?" Crowley was quiet for a long moment, gaze fixed beyond broken walls. "Because what happened back there, that wasn't right. A man don't sell his wife no matter what law says. And maybe I'm tired of looking the other way." "The woman, where is she?" "Safe for now. Doc Pike's got her at the clinic. But that won't last. Silas has ways of getting what he wants." Through the gap, Maddo could see smoke rising from cook fires throughout camp. The smell of beans and salt pork mixed with ever-present odors of unwashed bodies and fear. This wasn't a place where hope flourished. "Tell me about this Dr. Pike." "Eliza Pike. Came from Boston about 2 years back after her husband died in the war. She's different. Treats anyone who needs it, whether they can pay or not. Indians, Mexicans, doesn't matter to her. That makes her valuable, but also suspect. And you trust her. Much as I trust anyone in this place. Which isn't saying much." Maddo nodded slowly. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but allies were necessity. "What will Voss do?" "He'll wait for you to make the first move, then crush you. That's his way, patient calculating. He's not some hothead who'll come charging with guns blazing. He'll find your weakness and exploit it." But as Crowley spoke, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of guilt that Maddo caught despite the deputy's efforts to conceal it. The man was hiding something, struggling with some internal conflict that went deeper than mere concern for justice. "What aren't you telling me?" Maddo asked quietly. Crowley's face went pale. He looked away, then back, as if making a difficult decision. There's something else. About your sister." Maddo's blood ran cold. "What about her?" I've been carrying this burden for months. When those raiders hit your camp, they weren't just random killers looking for easy targets. They were hired, paid specifically to eliminate someone with tracking skills that posed a threat to certain business interests. What business interests? Stolen silver, or being smuggled out of federal mining claims and sold through networks of corrupt dealers. Your sister had apparently discovered one of their hidden caches, a way station where they processed stolen goods before moving them east. Mato felt the world tilt around him. How do you know this? Crowley reached into his coat with shaking hands and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, Mato's breath caught. It was the silver medallion, the one Winona had clutched in her frozen fist. But now he could see it clearly in lamplight, could make out the intricate engravings that marked it as the seal of the U.S. Assay Office, Denver, Denver. She brought this to me 3 days before the raid, Crowley whispered. Said she'd found it at a cache site along with crates of processed silver. She wanted to know if it meant anything, if it was evidence of wrongdoing. And you did nothing? I was scared. Voss had already made it clear what happened to people who interfered with his operations. I told her I'd look into it, but I never got the chance. The raid happened that same week. Mato took the medallion with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. Why tell me this now? Because I can't live with the guilt anymore. Because watching what happened to you and that woman today made me realize that some things are worth standing up for, no matter the personal cost. But even as Crowley spoke, Mato sensed there was more layers of complicity and compromise that the deputy wasn't ready to reveal. The man had been Voss's creature for too long to change sides without considerable internal struggle. Before Mato could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through ruins. Multiple riders moving fast and purposeful. Crowley grabbed Mato's arm. Get to the clinic, now. Don't let them take her. What about you? I'll buy you time. Maybe start making amends for my cowardice. Mato melted into shadows between buildings, moving with silent grace. While behind him, Crowley's voice rose in bureaucratic delays and demands for proper procedures. The clinic occupied what had been the schoolhouse, a sturdy log building that survived the flood through stubborn construction. Lamplight flickered through windows, and Mato could see figures moving within. He approached from the rear, where a small garden struggled in mountain soil. Through the back window, he saw her. Katerina sat on a wooden chair beside a pot-bellied stove hands, wrapped around a tin cup of chamomile tea. Her blonde hair had escaped its pins, framing a face younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with beauty that came from inner strength. Her condition was more advanced than he'd realized. She carried the child high and full, probably 7 months along. Beside her stood Dr. Eliza Pike, approaching 40 with graying hair, in a severe bun, and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she examined Katerina's rope burns. Need to keep these clean, the doctor was saying. Infection is always a risk, especially with fever going around. Thank you, Katerina replied, accent making simple words musical. I have some experience with wounds. My grandmother taught me healing before I was foolish enough to believe in promises. Commotion outside made both women look up. Mato pressed against the building as riders thundered past. Silas Voss's voice cut through night air like a blade. I want them found, the savage and woman, both $50, to the man who brings them back. Dr. Pike moved to the window, peering through curtains. Trouble. How much trouble? Katerina asked, voice steady, despite visible fear. The kind that gets people killed. The doctor gathered supplies from a wooden cabinet. Can you ride, if I must? You must. Dr. Pike stuffed bandages and bottles into a leather satchel. There's a back way out of town through the old mining trail. If you can reach Ephraim Cutter's farm on the other side of the ridge, you might have a chance. He's a good man, owes me favors. Mato made his decision. He moved to the back door and knocked softly 3 short taps. Conversation inside stopped immediately. Dr. Pike, he called quietly. It's Mato. I need to speak with you. After a long pause, footsteps approached, and the bolt was drawn back. The door opened to reveal Dr. Pike, holding a small derringer finger steady on the trigger. Her eyes assessed him with clinical precision. You're the one who bought her freedom. Yes. Why? Because no one else would. Something in his tone convinced her, because she stepped aside. Katerina rose as he entered, one hand braced against her back. Their eyes met across the small room, and again Mato felt that strange recognition, 2 lost souls in the same storm. They're hunting us, he said simply. I know. Katerina's voice held no surprise, only resignation. Barnaby was always weak, but never cruel. Silas Voss is both. Dr. Pike says there's a way out through the old mining trail. There is. Dr. Pike moved to a chest withdrawing men's clothing. But not for a pregnant woman on foot. The trail's treacherous in daylight, deadly at night. Then we wait for dawn. Dawn might be too late. She tossed the bundle to Katerina. Put these on. If we're lucky, people will mistake you for a young man in darkness. As Katerina moved behind a curtain to change, Dr. Pike fixed Mato with a steady stare. I need to know something. Are you here for revenge or justice? Is there a difference? There's always a difference. Revenge burns everything it touches. Justice builds something new from ashes. Mato thought of Winona's laughter, of how she'd sung while working hides of the future that died with her in frozen mud. My sister is beyond both now, but the men who killed her are not. And if pursuing them gets Katerina and her child killed? The question hung like smoke that couldn't be extinguished. Through the curtain, he could hear fabric rustle as Katerina transformed herself to survive in a world that saw her as property. Then I will have failed twice, he said finally. Dr. Pike nodded as if he'd passed some test. There's something else you should know about the men who killed your sister. She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This came addressed to the clinic 2 days ago. I think it was meant for you. Mato unfolded the paper with growing dread. It was a map hand-drawn but detailed showing mining claims and hidden caches throughout the territory. At the bottom, in a woman's careful script, were the words, For my brother, who taught me to see truth in tracks others could not follow, W. His vision blurred as he realized what he was holding. Winona had discovered more than just Voss's operation. She'd mapped it completely, documenting routes and locations with the same skill she'd used to track deer through wilderness. And somehow, she'd managed to get this evidence to safety before the raid that killed her. She was planning to expose the whole operation, Dr. Pike said quietly. The raid wasn't random. It was specifically designed to silence her before she could present this evidence to federal authorities. The curtain moved aside, and Katerina emerged, transformed. The men's clothing concealed her condition effectively, and in dim light, she could pass for a young man. But her eyes still held that steel-blue determination. How do I look? She asked. Like trouble, Dr. Pike said, with what might have been pride. Which is exactly what we need. Outside searching parties grew closer. Voices called through darkness, coordinating systematic sweeps. It wouldn't be long before they reached the clinic. There's something else, Katerina said quietly. She reached into her discarded dress and withdrew what appeared to be a fabric strip. But as she unfolded it, Maddo could see it was actually a concealed ledger, names and figures stitched into cloth with careful precision. "I keep records," she explained, "of Barnaby's debts, people he owes money to, games he's lost. Most are normal gambling losses, but look at this." She pointed to a series of entries marked with star symbols. "Payments to SV over the past 6 months. Each one corresponds to dates when Barnaby claimed to be working special jobs for extra money." Maddo compared the dates to Winona's map. They aligned perfectly with the cash locations his sister had documented. He wasn't just gambling away your money. He was being paid to serve as a courier for Voss's operation. Which means he knows about the silver thefts. A loud bang from the front made them freeze. Someone was pounding on the clinic door with a rifle butt. "Open up, we know you're in there." Dr. Pike moved swiftly to the back door. Time to go. But as Maddo reached for the handle, he heard boots landing in the garden outside. They'd surrounded the building. "Back window," he said quickly. "Too high," Dr. Pike replied, "and they'll see us the moment we try climbing out." The pounding grew more insistent. "Last chance, Doc, open this door, or we'll kick it in." Katerina moved to Maddo's side, her hand finding his arm with surprising steadiness. "Whatever happens, don't let them take me alive. My child deserves better than to be born into slavery." Maddo looked down at her upturned face, at courage burning in those blue eyes, and felt something shift in his heart's landscape. This was no longer just about Winona's death or his quest for vengeance. This was about the future, about whether strength and compassion could triumph over greed and cruelty. "They will not take you," he said, meaning it with every fiber. The front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. 3 armed men burst through like thunder, moving with coordinated precision, rifles ready, eyes sweeping shadows for prey. Maddo recognized the type-hardened men who'd learned their trade in range wars, where mercy was unaffordable luxury. "Search everywhere," commanded the lead man, tall and scarred with an elaborate mustache. A jagged scar ran from his temple to jaw, a souvenir of some knife fight. "Voss wants them alive, but he didn't say comfortable." Dr. Pike stepped from behind the medical cabinet, hands raised but chin high. "Gentlemen, this is a place of healing. Whatever business you have." "Our business is with the Indian and the pregnant woman," scarred man interrupted. "Where are they?" "I haven't seen any Indian. As for Mrs. Wainwright, she left hours ago with her husband." "Now that's interesting, because Barnaby's been drinking at the Silver Dollar since sunset, and he sure don't have his wife with him." The man's smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "So, either you're mistaken or you're lying." In the back room, Maddo pressed against the wall beside the doorway, knife ready. Katerina crouched behind a desk, one hand on her belly, and the other gripping the small club Dr. Pike had given her. The men's clothing provided camouflage in dim light, but wouldn't survive close scrutiny. "Check the back room, Charlie," scarred man ordered. Heavy footsteps approached. Maddo could hear the man's breathing smell sweat and whiskey clinging to his clothes. The rifle barrel appeared first, then a shoulder, then Maddo struck like a sidewinder, left hand clamping over the man's mouth, while his right brought the knife to the soft spot below the ear. Charlie's eyes went wide with shock. "Drop the rifle," Maddo whispered. "Make noise and you die." The weapon clattered to the floor. Charlie was big, thick through shoulders and gut, but fear had made him weak as a child. Maddo could feel tremors running through the man's body. "How many more?" Maddo breathed. Charlie held up 3 fingers. "Where?" The man pointed toward the front room, then gestured, indicating the buildings outside. 3 inside, at least that many surrounding them. Charlie, what's taking so long back there? A voice called. Maddo pressed the knife point just hard enough to draw a drop of blood. Tell them it's clear. One wrong word and you die. He eased his grip on the man's mouth, but kept the blade positioned. All clear. Charlie called, voice only slightly strained. Nobody here. You sure check under beds behind cabinets. Voss don't want mistakes. Already did, place is empty. Maddo felt some tension leave Charlie's body. The man thought he'd survive this encounter. Through the doorway, Maddo could see Dr. Pike engaging the searchers in conversation about medical supplies, buying precious time. That was when Katerina made her move, with desperate courage. She rose from behind the desk, like a ghost materializing from Shadow Club gripped in both hands. But instead of attacking Charlie, she moved to the back window and began working at the latch with quick, efficient movements. The wood was swollen from recent rains, but her fingers found the trick: gentle upward pressure combined with sideways twist. The window opened with barely a whisper. Maddo caught her eye and nodded toward the opening. She shook her head and pointed at him, then at Charlie. She wouldn't leave without him. Brave, but foolish. In her condition, she'd never run far enough to evade pursuit. And if caught together, Voss would have both prizes delivered. But there was no time to argue. From the front room came the sound of furniture being overturned, supplies crashing to the floor. The searchers were growing impatient. Charlie. Scarred man's voice carried new suspicion. Get your worthless hide out here. Maddo tightened his grip. Walk, he whispered. Slow and natural. Remember, I'm right behind you. They moved toward the doorway together, Maddo keeping his knife hand low and hidden. To casual observers, it would look like two men walking side by side. But beneath Charlie's shirt, the blade tip rested against his spine. As they entered the main room, Maddo took in the tactical situation with a warrior's eye. Scarred man stood near the overturned cabinet rifle, cradled easily. A second man, younger with nervous eyes, guarded the front door. Pike remained in the center, her medical bag at her feet, an expression carefully neutral. Find anything? Scarred man asked. Nothing, Charlie replied. Like I said, place is empty. But something in Charlie's posture alerted the leader. His eyes narrowed with predatory focus. You feeling all right, Charlie? You look peaked. Just tired. Been a long night. Scarred man's gaze shifted to Maddo, and for a heartbeat the two men stared at each other across the lamplit room. Recognition dawned. Gradually the clothes were wrong, but the face was unmistakably Native American. Unmistakably the man who'd humiliated Silas Voss. Well, I'll be damned, Scarred man said softly. Charlie, you want to explain why you're standing next to a redskin with a knife in his hand. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then everything exploded at once. Maddo shoved Charlie forward and dove left as Scarred man's rifle barked flame and thunder. The bullet took Charlie in the chest, spinning him around, before he collapsed in spreading blood. The nervous guard tried bringing his weapon to bear, but Dr. Pike was already moving with quick reflexes. She swung her heavy medical bag like a club, catching him across the temple and sending him stumbling into the doorframe rifle, discharging harmlessly into the ceiling. Maddo rolled behind an overturned table as another shot splintered wood inches from his head. His knife was perfect for close work but useless at rifle range. He needed to close distance, find another weapon, or the back window exploded inward as Katerina came through feet first, like an avenging angel, her club swinging in a devastating arc that caught Scarred man across the back of his head with full force of desperation and maternal fury. The rifle flew from his hands as he stumbled forward, blood streaming from his scalp. But he was tough, already recovering and reaching for the pistol at his hip. The rifle, Mato shouted. Katerina was already moving despite her awkward condition pregnancy, making every movement a calculation of balance and momentum. She reached the fallen rifle just as Scarred Man cleared his revolver, the two of them grappling over the long gun in deadly ballet. The rifle barrel wavered between them while they fought for control with desperate strength. Katerina's face was set in absolute determination. She would not be taken, not sold again. Then Mato was there, his knife sliding between Scarred Man's ribs with surgical precision. The steel found its target with hardly resistance, slipping past bone to find the heart that had pumped blood through a lifetime of violence. Scarred Man's eyes went wide, then gradually empty as life fled. He collapsed beside Charlie's body, their blood mingling on the clinic floor. The nervous guard had recovered enough to raise his rifle again, but Dr. Pike was ready. The derringer in her hand spoke once with a sharp crack. The man screamed and dropped his weapon, clutching his ruined shoulder. "Don't kill me," he begged. "Please, I got a wife and children." Mato retrieved the fallen rifle and checked its loading 5 cartridges remaining, enough to fight their way out if they were lucky. "How many more outside?" he demanded. 3, maybe 4. I don't know exactly. Voss just said to search every building. "Where are they positioned?" "Front of the building, watching the horses. 1 on each side street." "That's all I know." Dr. Pike examined the wounded man with professional detachment. "Clean through the shoulder. You'll live assuming you don't do anything else stupid." She looked up at Mato and Katerina, face grim. "We need to leave immediately. The gunshots will bring every man in Voss's employ and probably half the town." Katerina was breathing hard, one hand pressed to her side where a stitch had developed during the brief but violent struggle. The fight had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. "I can make it to the horses," she said with more confidence than her condition warranted. "No." Mato's voice was flat with certainty. "Too many rifles between here and the stable. We go out the back into the mining claims. Lose ourselves in darkness. The mines have been flooded since the storm," Dr. Pike protested. "Treacherous in daylight, deadly at night. Better than facing rifles in open street with nowhere to run." As if to emphasize his point, voices began calling from outside, men converging on the clinic drawn by gunfire. Soon, they'd be completely surrounded. Dr. Pike grabbed her medical bag and moved toward the shattered window. "There's an old trail through the mining claims to the high country. If you can reach Ephraim Cutter's farm on the far side of the ridge, he'll help you. He's a good man who owes me favors." What about you?" "I'll stay and tend to the wounded, try to buy you time by claiming the shooting was accidental. It won't hold up under scrutiny, but it might give you the head start you need." She moved to the wounded guard and began binding his shoulder with strips of clean cloth. "Go now before it's too late." Mato helped Katerina through the broken window frame, then followed her into the small garden. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and snow from high peaks. Behind them, the clinic's windows glowed with lamplight, and he could already hear Dr. Pike's voice raised in explanation as searchers arrived. "This way," he whispered, leading Katerina toward the dark bulk of mountains that rose above Copper Gulch, like a wall between them and freedom. They moved through abandoned mining claims like ghosts, stepping carefully around rusted equipment and water-filled shafts. The flood had transformed the area into a treacherous maze, but it also provided cover from searching eyes. Every few minutes, Mato paused to listen for pursuit. So far, their escape seemed undetected, but he knew that wouldn't last once Voss's men organized a proper search. Katerina stumbled on a coil of abandoned cable, and Mato caught her arm to steady her. Even through heavy cloth, he could feel exhaustion tremors in her muscles. "Do you need to rest?" he asked quietly. She shook her head with stubborn determination. Not yet. They'll be following soon enough. As if summoned by her words, a shout echoed from town's direction. Someone had discovered their escape route. Soon there would be search parties with torches combing every inch of the mining district. They climbed higher, following a precarious path that switchbacked up the steep slope between towering piles of mining waste and rusted machinery skeletons. The air grew thinner with each step, and Katerina's breathing became labored despite her efforts to maintain pace. At a sharp bend, Matos stopped and looked back toward the settlement. Torches were already moving through the mining claims, in organized patterns, a dozen pinpricks of light, spreading out in systematic search. They had perhaps an hour's lead before pursuit caught up, maybe less, if Voss's men knew the terrain better than expected. How much farther to this farmer's place? Katerina asked, voice tight with exhaustion, and something else, a new kind of pain that made Mato's blood run cold. He studied the terrain ahead, trying to match landscape to mental maps. The trail led to a saddle between two peaks, then down into the valley where Ephraim Cutter's farm supposedly lay. In daylight, with a healthy person setting pace, it would be a challenging 3-hour walk. At night, with a pregnant woman in early stages of labor. "We will reach safety," he said, because it was what she needed to hear. But privately, he began calculating how long it would take pursuers to circle around the mountain and cut off escape routes, and whether they'd have enough ammunition for the running fight that seemed increasingly inevitable. Behind them, the torches continued their relentless advance through darkness, each flickering light representing an armed man who would kill them both without hesitation. The ancient mining trail carved across the mountainside like a healing scar, barely wide enough for single-file passage. To their left rose a granite wall reaching toward stars. To their right, the ground fell away into darkness, so complete it might have been the world's edge. Katerina pressed her back against cold stone and tried not to look down into that waiting abyss. The men's clothing that had seemed clever disguise in the clinic now felt like a death trap, loose fabric caught on every projection, threatening to pull her off balance with each mountain wind gust. "Breathe slowly," Matos said quietly from his position, a head rifle slung across his back and one hand extended toward her in support. "Trust your feet. They know where to step." She nodded and forced herself forward, one careful step at a time. The baby kicked frantically against her ribs, as if protesting this midnight adventure. She found herself speaking to the unborn child in whispered Czech-old lullabies. Her grandmother had sung promises that everything would be well, even though she no longer believed them herself. Below them, torches had spread across the mining claims like fallen constellations. She could hear voices calling through darkness, sound distorted by distance and echo, until it became something inhuman that made her skin crawl. "How many men do you think Voss has out there?" she asked during a brief lull between contractions. Mato paused to study the lights scattered below. 20, perhaps more. He has called in every favor, promised every debt forgiveness to get this many mobilized. All this for one pregnant woman. Not for you personally. His voice carried grim understanding. For what you represent to him. A challenge to his authority that he cannot allow to go unanswered. If he lets us escape, others might think him weak. The brutal truth settled over her like a cold blanket. This had never been about Barnaby's debts or even her freedom. It was about power, the absolute control men like Silas Voss needed to maintain their grip on places where fear was the only currency that mattered. They reached a wider section, where an old mine entrance had been carved into the mountainside. The tunnel mouth gaped black and forbidding, supported by timber that looked ready to collapse. But it offered shelter from cutting mountain air and a chance to rest without fear of falling. Katerina sank onto a boulder, pressing both hands to her lower back. The pain was definitely getting worse. Not yet the sharp agony of true labor, but the deep ache that came from carrying too much weight too long, combined with stress of their desperate flight. She had delivered enough babies in Prague to recognize the signs her body was preparing itself, whether she was ready or not. "How far to this farmer's place?" she asked. Matto crouched beside the mine entrance and peered into impenetrable darkness. 3 miles, possibly 4, but the path becomes more treacherous before it improves. "I can make it." He turned to study her face in starlight. "Can you tell me honestly? I need to know what we're facing." The question was asked without judgment, but it cut deep. She wanted to insist she was stronger than she looked, that pregnancy hadn't made her helpless. But lying would serve no purpose except to get them both killed. "I don't know," she admitted. "The baby has dropped lower, I can feel the difference. And the walking combined with everything that's happened." "When was the child due?" 6 weeks, perhaps 7. But first babies sometimes come early, especially when the mother has been subjected to severe stress. Matto remained quiet, gaze fixed on torches that had reached the mountain trail's base and were beginning their methodical ascent. In clear air, she could hear their pursuit with terrifying clarity. Iron horseshoes against stone jingle of spurs and bridles occasional curses as riders stumbled on treacherous footing. "There is another way," he said finally. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the mine entrance. These tunnels were part of a larger network connecting multiple operations. Some passages go completely through the mountain, emerging near the valley floor. Katerina felt her blood turn to ice. "You want us to go into the mine in complete darkness?" "It would be far safer than remaining on this exposed trail." "Safer?" She stared at him in disbelief. Those tunnels could collapse or flood or be filled with poisonous gases. And even if we avoid dying from cave-ins, how would we find our way out? We could wander in circles for days. The alternative is facing 20 armed men on a narrow trail with no cover and nowhere to run. The logic was unassailable, but that didn't make it less terrifying. Katerina had heard stories about the mines men who'd gone in and never emerged cave-ins that buried entire crews alive, pockets of deadly gas that could kill before you knew you were in danger. The thought of carrying her unborn child into that subterranean maze made her stomach clench with nausea. But the sound of pursuit was growing louder. The torches had reached the first switchback, and she could make out individual voices, men calling instructions, organizing their search with military efficiency. "How do you know about these connecting tunnels?" she asked. "I have been watching this town for days, learning its secrets. There are survey maps in the mining office, old drawings from when these shafts were first excavated. Most of the major workings connect to a central drainage tunnel that carries water out to the main creek. Most of them, the ones that have not suffered structural collapse." It was hardly reassuring, but it was better than certain death at Voss's hands. Katerina struggled to her feet, ignoring sharp protest from her back muscles. "All right," she said. "But if we get lost down there and die, I'm blaming you for eternity." Matto's smile was barely visible in starlight. "That seems fair." He led the way into the mine entrance, moving slowly to give their eyes time to adjust to deeper darkness. The tunnel was perhaps 6 feet wide and 7 feet high, enough room to walk upright, but narrow enough to feel confined. The air smelled of damp stone and rotting timber, with an underlying metallic tang of ore and blasting powder. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space sound, bouncing off unseen walls to create acoustic maze that disoriented her sense of direction immediately. Katerina kept one hand on the tunnel wall and the other on Matto's shoulder, letting him guide her through shadows while trying not to think about countless tons of rock suspended above their heads by rotting timber supports. "Here," he said, stopping at what felt like a junction where multiple passages met. The main shaft continues downward. We take this side tunnel. The passage he indicated was even narrower than the entrance, barely wide enough for one person. Worse, it sloped downward at an angle that made each step treacherous, especially for someone whose balance had been compromised by pregnancy and exhaustion. But she could feel faint air current moving through it, subtle breeze that suggested an opening somewhere ahead, connection to the outside world that offered hope of eventual escape. They had progressed perhaps 50 yards when they heard voices at the mine entrance behind them. Tracks lead this way. Could be a dead end. Most old shafts don't connect to nothing useful. Voss said check everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Torch glow began penetrating the tunnel system, casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls that made darkness seem alive, with malevolent purpose. Katerina pressed against cold stone and tried to make herself invisible, though she knew it was hopeless if their pursuers explored this particular passage. Mato touched her arm and pointed ahead. In faint torchlight reflection, she could just make out another junction. This one offering passages in 3 directions. They moved toward it as quickly as treacherous footing allowed feet shuffling through loose rock and debris accumulated over years of neglect. The voices behind them were getting closer. She could hear boots scraping against stone, men trying to move quietly through unfamiliar terrain and failing. One was breathing heavily, probably unaccustomed to thin mountain air. This way, Mato whispered, guiding her into the leftmost passage. This tunnel was different from the others, older, with walls carved by hand rather than blasted with explosives. The ceiling was lower too, forcing them to duck their heads as they moved deeper into the mountain's heart. But the air current was stronger here, carrying scents of pine and snow that meant they were heading toward some kind of opening. Behind them, torch glow gradually faded as searchers chose different passages. But Katerina knew this was only temporary reprieve. Sooner or later, they would systematically explore every tunnel. The passage began sloping upward, filling her with hope that was immediately crushed when they rounded a bend and found their way blocked by something that made her heart sink. Standing water. The recent floods had filled this section completely, creating an underground lake that stretched away into darkness like a black mirror. "Can we go around it?" she asked. Mato waded a few steps into dark water, testing depth. The surface came up to his knees, then waist, then chest as he moved deeper. He turned back, shaking his head. Too deep to walk through and no way to tell how far the flooding extends. Katerina sank onto a dry ledge, feeling despair settle over her shoulders like a lead blanket. They were trapped between flooded tunnel ahead and armed searchers behind, with no way forward and no safe way back. That was when she felt it, the unmistakable tightening across her belly that she'd been dreading. She pressed her hands to her swollen abdomen and counted seconds as the contraction built, then gradually subsided. 30 seconds of intense pressure. Not active labor yet, but definitely a warning that her body was reaching absolute limits. "The baby," she said quietly. Mato turned from his examination of the flooded tunnel, and she saw something like panic flicker across his usually composed features. "What about the baby?" "I think we need to find a way out very soon. The stress is making things happen faster than they should." He was at her side instantly, warriors training temporarily overwhelmed by a situation he had no experience handling. "How soon?" "Hours, maybe less. With first babies it's usually longer, but there are no guarantees when the mother has been through what I've experienced." For a moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders straightened with visible resolve, and he moved back toward the water's edge. "Then we swim," he said with absolute finality. "I can't swim, not in my condition. The weight would pull me under." Then I carry you across just as I would carry a wounded warrior from a battlefield." The simple certainty in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion she wasn't ready to examine. This man who owed her nothing was prepared to risk his life in flooded darkness. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this?" Matto was quiet for a long moment, gaze fixed on something beyond their vision. When he spoke, his voice carried weight of old pain. "Because 6 months ago I let my sister die when she needed me most. I was not there to protect her when raiders came to our winter camp. I will not make that mistake again." The words hung between them like a bridge built from shared loss and regret. Katerina understood then that this had never really been about her any more than it was about Silas Voss or the men who'd murdered his family. This was about a man trying to redeem himself through salvation of another. "Your sister, what was her name?" "Winona. It means firstborn daughter." "Tell me about her." A smile ghosted across his weathered features. She could track a wounded deer across bare rock when other hunters found no sign. She laughed like water running over smooth stones. She was planning to marry a young warrior named Thunderhorse when spring grass returned. "I'm sorry for your loss." She was. And she died believing the future could be better than the past, despite all evidence to the contrary. He turned back to the water and began removing his shirt. "We go now before contractions become stronger. I will carry you across and we will find our way out together." Katerina looked at the black water at unknown depths that might conceal anything from sinkholes to bones of long-dead miners. Then she looked at Matto at scars on his chest that spoke of old battles, at steady strength in his hands, at determination in his eyes that hadn't wavered, even facing impossible odds. "All right," she said, "but if we both drown down here, I will never forgive you." His laugh was soft, but genuine. "That seems entirely fair." He helped her into frigid water with infinite care, his arms strong and sure as they took her weight. The water was shockingly cold, but his body heat kept the worst of chill at bay. She wrapped her arms around his neck and tried not to think about darkness beneath them, weight of stone above them, or armed men somewhere behind them in the tunnel maze. Instead, she thought about Winona, a young woman she'd never met, who had laughed like water over stones and would never see her Thunderhorse again. And she thought about her own unborn child, still safe within her womb, but already loved beyond measure, who deserved a chance to see sun rise over something better than Copper Gulch's poisoned streets. Matto moved through dark water with steady strokes, his breathing controlled despite the burden he carried, and cold that must have been numbing his extremities. Behind them, torch glow appeared at the flooded section as their pursuers finally discovered the correct passage. Shouts echoed through underground chambers as searchers found evidence of their quarry's passage, but voices seemed distant and distorted by water and stone. Ahead of them, somewhere in absolute darkness, lay either salvation or death. And sometimes, when you had run as far as you could run and climbed as high as you could climb, that kind of uncertainty was the closest thing to hope you were likely to find. The underground lake stretched much farther than either had imagined. Matto's powerful strokes carried them through water that tasted of copper and ancient stone, past submerged mining equipment that loomed from darkness like mechanical skeletons. Gradually, the faint light ahead grew stronger and more distinct. She began making out details: rough stone walls that curved organically, clearly carved by centuries of natural water flow rather than human engineering. They were in a natural cave system now shaped by underground streams and geological forces that had been at work since long before humans set foot on this continent. Cave mouth. Matto gasped as they reached another ledge. 50 feet above us. Katerina looked where he pointed and felt her heart sink. The opening was clearly visible, a ragged hole in the cave ceiling through which stars twinkled. but the walls between their position and freedom were nearly vertical slick, with moisture offering few handholds. "I can climb it," Maddow said, following her gaze, "but not carrying you." Another contraction hit her, then stronger than any before. She gritted her teeth and rode it out, counting seconds until it passed. 3 minutes since the last one, Maddow observed grimly. The numbers painted a picture neither wanted to acknowledge but could no longer ignore. Her body was preparing for birth, whether they found safety or not. But as she struggled to her feet, fighting waves of pain, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken with hope rather than despair. The cave wall wasn't completely vertical, or there were ledges, cracks, places where centuries of water flow had carved horizontal shelves into the stone. More importantly, she could see something else. A narrow stream emerging from a crack in the cave wall, cascading down into darkness. But she could see where it came from, a horizontal passage just wide enough for a person to crawl through. "There," she pointed. "That's our way out." But even as she spoke, the sound of their pursuers grew much closer. Torchlight began reflecting off the water's surface, and she could hear individual voices clearly now. "They went this way. I can see where they climbed out." "How many torches we got left?" "Enough. Spread out, check every crack and crevice. Voss wants them alive, but he didn't say comfortable." Maddow's jaw tightened as he assessed their situation. The horizontal passage was their only escape route, but reaching it would require climbing at least 30 feet of treacherous cave wall, while pursuers with rifles took position below. But Katerina was already moving her mind, working with clarity that surprised her. She pulled off her outer shirt, leaving only the thin chemise underneath, and began tearing the fabric into strips. "What are you doing?" Maddow asked. "Creating a distraction." She knotted the strips together into a long rope of sorts, then tied one end around a loose rock. "When I throw this into the water on the far side of the cave, they'll think we went that direction. Give us a few minutes to reach that passage." "In your condition?" "I've been climbing since I was a child in Prague. My father was a roofer." She was already finding her first handhold pregnancy, making her movements careful, but not impossible. "Besides, what choice do we have?" She was right, and they both knew it. Maddow helped boost her up to the first ledge, then followed as she began working her way across the cave wall toward the horizontal passage. Behind them, armed men reached the underground lake. Katerina waited until she heard boots on stone, then hurled her makeshift rope with its weighted end toward the far side of the cave. The splash echoed loudly through the chamber. "There, they're trying to swim across. Light the torches, don't let them get away." As their pursuers rushed toward the false trail, Maddow and Katerina continued their desperate climb. Each movement was agony for her now. The contractions were coming every 90 seconds, and each one threatened to tear her grip loose from the stone. But somehow, through determination and desperation, they reached the horizontal passage just as the first gunshots echoed through the cave below. "This way," Maddow whispered, helping her into the narrow tunnel. The passage was barely 3 feet high, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through the mountain's heart. But she could feel air moving through it, carrying the sweet scent of pine that meant freedom. Behind them, angry voices discovered their deception, but by then, it was too late. The tunnel stretched ahead like a birth canal, leading from darkness into light, and at its far end, Katerina could see stars. They had made it through the mountain. She emerged into a world transformed by moonlight. They stood on a hillside, overlooking a valley, where scattered farmsteads dotted the landscape like islands of warmth in an ocean of silver grass. The air was cold and clean, free of the smoke and decay that had choked Copper Gulch. "Ephraim Cutter's place," Matos said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings about a mile away. We made it. But even as he spoke, Katerina felt another contraction building, this one stronger than any before. She gripped his arm as pain washed over her, and when it passed, she knew with absolute certainty that they had run out of time. "The baby?" she gasped. "It's coming. Now." In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of horses and men emerging from other parts of the mountain cave system. Silas Voss's searchers had found alternate routes, and they were closing in from multiple directions. Mato looked at the farmstead, then at the approaching sounds of pursuit, then at Katerina's face in the moonlight. His expression was grim but determined. "Then we make our stand here," he said simply. The hillside offered little natural fortification, scattered boulders, and a few stunted pines that provided concealment but no real protection from rifle fire. Mato helped Katerina to a sheltered spot behind the largest boulder movements, quick and efficient, despite exhaustion lining his face. "How long?" he asked while checking his rifle loads. Katerina pressed her back against cold stone and tried to assess her body's signals through haze of pain and fear. The contractions were coming fast now, barely 90 seconds apart, and each brought pressure that seemed to threaten splitting her in half. "Not long at all," she managed. "Maybe an hour if we're lucky. Maybe much less." He nodded grimly and took position at the edge of their makeshift shelter rifle, trained on approaches from the mountain. In moonlight, she could see tension coiled in his shoulders and the way his jaw was set with determination that came from knowing there would be no retreat. The sound of pursuit was growing louder, horses picking their way down rocky slopes, men calling to each other as they coordinated their search. From her position, Katerina could count at least 6 different voices, possibly more. Too many for one exhausted warrior to fight. "There's still time for you to reach that farm," she said during a brief lull. "Find help?" "No." His voice was flat as iron. "We stay together. We face whatever comes as one. This isn't your fight anymore." He turned to look at her then, and in his dark eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not just determination, but recognition that went beyond circumstances that had brought them together. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is my fight. It has been from the moment I chose to spend my silver on your freedom." Before she could ask what he meant, another contraction seized her with the force of a physical blow. This one was different, longer, stronger, accompanied by an overwhelming urge to push that could not be denied. A rifle shot cracked through the night air, the bullet striking the boulder inches from Mato's head and sending stone chips flying. He rolled to a new position and returned fire, his shot echoing across the valley like thunder. "Give it up, savage." Silas Voss's voice carried clearly through cold mountain air. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Send out the woman, and maybe we'll let you die quick." Mato's answer was another precisely aimed shot that sent one of the approaching searchers diving for cover behind a fallen log. But Katerina could see the tactical situation clearly. They were surrounded low on ammunition, fighting a defensive battle that could only end one way, unless some miracle intervened. "I can see them," she gasped, pointing toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. 3 men, and there... She indicated a stand of pines to their left. "At least 2 more." "Can you still shoot?" Mato asked. She almost laughed at the absurdity. "I'm about to give birth while being shot at by professional killers. What do you think?" But even as she spoke, she was reaching for the spare rifle. Her hands shook with pain and exhaustion, but her grandfather had taught her to shoot when she was 12, and muscle memory was stronger than conscious thought. Another bullet whined off the boulder, followed by 2 more from different directions. The searchers were closing in with methodical precision, using disciplined volleys to keep their quarry pinned while they maneuvered for better positions. Matto fired twice in quick succession, and someone screamed in darkness, a sound of pain and surprise that suggested at least one bullet had found its target. But almost immediately, answering shots came from 3 different locations, forcing him to pull back behind cover. "We need to move," he said, though they both knew movement was no longer realistic. "This position won't hold." "I can't move." Katerina's voice was strained with effort of speaking through another mounting contraction. "The baby is coming now." As if to emphasize her words, she felt the unmistakable urge to push an instinctive compulsion older than civilization. Her body was taking control, following biological imperatives programmed into human females for thousands of generations. Matto's expression changed as he grasped the reality of their situation. They could not run, could not hide, could barely maintain their current defensive position. In minutes, Katerina would be completely helpless during the most vulnerable moment of birth, and he would be trying to defend both her and a newborn infant against overwhelming odds. But as he prepared to move to a better firing position, something unexpected happened. The night air, which had been still, suddenly filled with the sound of rolling rocks and shifting stone from multiple directions around their position. Matto's head snapped up, his warrior instincts immediately alert. Those weren't natural sounds. Someone was moving through the darkness above them, using the terrain, with a kind of skill that suggested extensive knowledge of mountain warfare. "What?" Katerina began, but Matto held up a hand for silence. In the distance, one of Voss's men called out in alarm. "Something's moving up there above us." "Where? Can't tell. Sounds like it's coming from everywhere." The coordinated gunfire from their attackers faltered as the men tried to assess this new threat. Through the darkness, Katerina could hear confused voices, the sound of men trying to reposition themselves to face an unknown danger. That was when she understood what was happening. Matto hadn't been idle during their climb through the mountains. Somewhere along the way, he had been setting up contingencies using his knowledge of the terrain to create the very kind of trap he'd needed when the moment came. "The rockfall above the pine grove," she said quietly. "You rigged it." Matto's smile was grim but satisfied. A warrior uses every weapon available to him, including the mountain itself. As if responding to his words, a rumbling sound echoed through the darkness above them, the sound of carefully balanced stones finally giving way to gravity and momentum. The avalanche wasn't massive, but it was precisely placed crashing down into the grove, where at least 2 of their attackers had taken position. Screams echoed through the night as men scrambled to avoid being crushed, their disciplined assault dissolving into chaos as they fought for their lives against tons of falling rock. But Matto wasn't finished. As the rockfall subsided, he rose from behind their boulder shelter and began moving with deadly purpose through the darkness, using the confusion to close distance with their remaining attackers. His rifle spoke twice. Then he was gone, melting into shadows, like a ghost seeking vengeance. Katerina heard the sounds of hand-to-hand combat in the darkness, the ring of steel on steel, grunts of effort and pain, the sharp crack of breaking bone. Matto was fighting with the silent efficiency of a warrior in his natural element, using darkness and terrain as weapons just as deadly as knife or rifle. But even as he systematically eliminated their attackers, Katerina felt her body demanding her complete attention. The baby was crowning. She could feel the burning pressure that meant birth was imminent, probably within the next few contractions. She gripped the hem of her shirt and pushed with all her strength, feeling her child's head emerge into the cold mountain air. The sensation was indescribable, part agony, part triumph, part miracle that defied rational explanation. "Matto?" She gasped, but her voice was lost in the sound of his final confrontation with Silas Voss himself. The mine foreman had survived the rockfall and the systematic elimination of his men. But he was no longer the composed predator who had terrorized Copper Gulch. His expensive suit was torn, his face was bleeding from multiple cuts, and his eyes held the wild desperation of a man who had finally met someone more dangerous than himself. "You think you've won," Voss snarled, raising his pistol with shaking hands. "You think killing me will change anything? There are a dozen men like me for every one of you savages." "Perhaps," Matto said quietly, his knife already in motion before Voss could pull the trigger. "But you will not be one of them." The blade found its target with surgical precision, and Silas Voss collapsed with a surprised expression on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe that his reign of terror had finally come to an end. Matto turned at the sound of the baby's first cry, and his entire face transformed with an expression of wonder. He had helped bring life into the world instead of dealing death, and the change in him was profound. "She's here," Katerina whispered, pulling her daughter to her chest and wrapping the infant in torn fabric of her shirt. "She's finally here. She's beautiful," Matto said simply, his rifle finally lowered as the last of their enemies lay dead in the darkness around them. Katerina looked down at her daughter's face, red and wrinkled and utterly beautiful in the moonlight. She thought of Winona, the sister who would never marry her thunder horse, who had died so that others might learn the true value of freedom. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope. Because sometimes when you have lost everything and found yourself in the darkest places, hope is what carries you through to dawn. And sometimes hope is what you give back to the world in return for the miracle of survival." 3 days after Hope's dramatic entrance into the world, Katerina sat in the warm kitchen of Ephraim Cutter's farmhouse, her daughter sleeping peacefully in a hand-carved cradle the farmer had crafted during long winter months. Dr. Pike had arrived the morning after their mountain confrontation, having followed the trail of bodies and blood to its conclusion. She had pronounced both mother and child to be in remarkably good health, considering the circumstances. "Extraordinary," she had said while conducting her examination. "Giving birth under those conditions should have killed you both. But look at her perfect weight, strong lungs, no complications whatsoever." Now, as Katerina watched sunrise paint distant mountains in shades of gold and rose, she found herself thinking that extraordinary seemed too small a word. Miraculous might come closer to the truth. Ephraim Cutter had proven to be exactly what Dr. Pike had promised, a good man who asked no questions and offered whatever help he could provide. He was in his 50s, widowed for nearly a decade, with the quiet competence that came from years of wresting a living from difficult land. "More coffee?" he asked, refilling her cup, without waiting for an answer. It had become a morning ritual, the three of them sharing breakfast, while Hope slept, discussing the events that had brought them together and the choices that lay ahead. Matto sat across from her at the wooden table, his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. Even here in this sanctuary of domestic peace, he remained alert to danger. But the harsh lines had visibly softened in his weathered face, and she had caught him more than once watching the baby with profound tenderness. "Any word from town about the legal proceedings?" she asked. Ephraim nodded toward a folded newspaper beside his plate. "Deputy Crowley brought news this morning, along with that Denver paper. Seems the federal authorities have been investigating Voss's operation for months. With him dead and his records seized, they've rounded up most of the theft ring." He paused to sip his coffee. "Your husband's been cleared of the murder charges, but he's still facing federal charges for his role in the silver operation. 10 to 15 years, assuming he cooperates with their investigation." The news should have brought some satisfaction, but instead Katerina felt only weary sadness. Barnaby had made his choices and would face the consequences. There was no triumph in his downfall, only recognition that some mistakes carried prices that could never be fully paid. "What about Mattow's situation?" she asked. "Deputy Crowley says the federal marshal wants to meet with him. Apparently, eliminating Voss's operation has earned him some powerful friends in Washington. They're offering safe passage to Canada, plus a federal safe conduct papers for any past conflicts with territorial authorities." Mattow looked up from his coffee-dark eyes, sharp with interest despite his apparent calm. "There's more," Ephraim continued. "They're also offering him employment as an interpreter and scout attached to the U.S. Marshal, helping resolve conflicts between tribal groups and territorial authorities. The kind of work that might prevent more violence like what happened to his sister." Katerina found herself holding her breath. This was an opportunity that could change everything, not just for Mattow personally, but for countless others caught between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Mattow was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on mother and child. "I think," he said finally, "that Winona would want me to choose the path that prevents more sisters from dying. The path that builds bridges instead of burning them. And the Czech settlement near Bismarck is not so far from the Canadian border," he replied with a slight smile. "And a skilled midwife might be welcome in any community, regardless of which side of a political line it sits on." Katerina looked down at Hope, who had settled back into peaceful sleep against her shoulder. Her daughter would grow up in a world very different from the one she had known, a world where women might own property and make their own choices, where children of mixed heritage might find acceptance rather than persecution. But that better world would not build itself. It would require people willing to cross boundaries, to risk everything for the possibility of something greater than themselves. "It won't be easy," she said. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." She thought about the Spanish silver he had spent on her freedom, about the flooded mine and desperate climb through darkness, about the moment when he had chosen to stay and fight rather than flee to safety. This man who had owed her nothing had given her everything that mattered. "All right," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We'll try to build something together." His smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then we will succeed." Outside the kitchen window, the valley stretched away toward distant mountains where snow still crowned the highest peaks. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay whatever future they would create together, uncertain and challenging, but bright with possibilities neither could have imagined just a week ago. 2 weeks later, they stood on the platform of the Territorial Railroad Station in Boulder Hope, bundled warmly against Katerina's chest, while their few possessions sat in a single leather bag at their feet. The Denver and Rio Grande locomotive pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes, its black bulk gleaming in early sunlight. Passengers began disembarking, businessmen, families, miners, heading north to seek their fortunes in the Dakota Territory. "Nervous?" Mattow asked, appearing at her elbow with their tickets. "Terrified," she admitted, but in a good way. He had traded his traditional clothing for practical frontier garb, dark trousers, wool shirt, and a coat that would keep him warm during the journey north. But he still wore his hair in traditional braids, and the eagle feather behind his ear marked him unmistakably as Lakota. As they settled into their seats, Katerina found herself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Marshal Pine had made good on his promises. Mattow now carried federal papers guaranteeing safe passage, along with a standing offer of employment he could accept or decline based on how their new life developed. The Czech settlement of Nova Naděje, New Hope, had responded enthusiastically to Dr. Pike's letters, welcoming the prospect of a skilled midwife who could also provide traditional healing knowledge. Most importantly, they were traveling towards something they had chosen together, rather than fleeing from something imposed by circumstances beyond their control. "Any second thoughts?" she asked as the train gathered momentum. Maddo considered the question while watching familiar mountain landscape roll past their window. "About leaving Nummer. About what we're trying to build together. Hope mixed with uncertainty, which seems appropriate for people starting a new life." Hope stirred against Katarina's chest, making small sounds that indicated she was waking from her nap. The baby had adapted remarkably well to travel sleeping peacefully through noise and motion that would have disturbed many infants. "She's getting stronger every day," Maddo observed. "Babies do that when they're properly fed and cared for and surrounded by people who love them. All things that were not guaranteed 2 weeks ago." A comfortable silence settled between them as the train continued north, carrying them across rolling prairie toward their uncertain but hopeful destination. Through the window, Katarina could see farms and ranches scattered across the landscape, like evidence of other people who had chosen to build new lives in challenging but beautiful country. "What will you tell her when she's old enough to ask about her birth?" Maddo asked. Katarina looked down at Hope's peaceful face, trying to imagine the woman this tiny infant would someday become. "I'll tell her the truth. That she was born free because a brave man decided her freedom was worth more than his silver. That she took her first breath under stars that have watched over both our peoples for countless generations. And that she came into the world surrounded by people who believed the future could be better than the past." The train rocked gently as it navigated a curve, and Katarina found herself thinking about the generations of her own family who had struggled against various forms of oppression. Her great-grandmother had survived Habsburg persecution of Czech culture. Her grandmother had fought to preserve traditional healing knowledge in the face of Austrian medical orthodoxy. Her mother had dared to dream of America as a place where such struggles might finally end. And now she held in her arms a daughter who would grow up free from all those old burdens, free to choose her own path, her own identity, her own definition of what home and family could mean. As darkness fell outside their window, Katarina found herself reflecting on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been property of a gambling addict, facing a future of degradation and despair. Now she was traveling toward a new home with a daughter born free and a partner who had proven himself worthy of trust through actions rather than words. Not a romantic partner in the conventional sense that was something they had both carefully avoided discussing, understanding their relationship had been forged in crisis and needed time to develop naturally. But a true partner nonetheless, someone who shared her commitment to building something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. "Maddo," she said as the train pulled into another small station. "Yes, thank you. For everything you've done, everything you've risked, everything you've given up to help Hope and me reach this point." He turned from the window to look at her, and in his dark eyes, she saw not just the warrior who had fought for her freedom, but the man who had chosen healing over revenge, hope over hatred. "Thank you," he replied quietly, "for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, and that the future can indeed be better than the past if people are willing to work together to make it so." The train whistle blew a long, mournful sound that echoed across the prairie darkness like a song of welcome, calling them toward whatever adventures awaited in the land ahead. Katarina held her daughter close and watched the stars appear in the vast Dakota sky, and for the first time in many years, she felt truly free and genuinely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring.